ask that everyone please ensure that they are muted throughout the giving of the statement. Thank you for your attendance this morning. The Institute of Race Relations today launches an international campaign of interaction with the most important and prominent donor nations to the International Monetary Fund. This pertains to the provision of financial support to the South African government and why the International Monetary Fund and its donor nations must take full and honest cognizance of the policies and policy intentions of the African National Congress and its alliance partners, the South African Communist Party and the Congress of South African Trade Unions. The countries the Institute will be approaching are the United States of America, Japan, China, Germany, France, the United Kingdom, Italy, India, Russia, Brazil, Canada, Saudi Arabia, Spain, Mexico, the Netherlands, South Korea, Australia, Belgium, Switzerland, and Indonesia. It is 43 years ago today that the United Nations Special Committee Against Apartheid convened a summit at the Palais des Nations in Geneva to decide how the international community must respond to the worsening situation in South Africa, following the South African state's use of violence against its own citizens in pursuit of the furtherance of its ideological ends and political survival. South Africa is no longer the nation it was then, and for this, much of the credit must go to the people of this country who, when duty fell on them to alter the trajectory of our nation, made the right decisions to give freedom a fighting chance. The changes for the betterment of our country achieved since 1977 attest to the strength, integrity, and decency of the South African people. Recently, some claims were made that our country and some of its people were better off under the apartheid regime, especially relating to the situation of Black South Africans. This is a sentiment of dangerous inaccuracy that overlooks the dehumanization of especially Black South Africans under the rule of ideologically entrenched racial discrimination. It is also a sentiment that ignores the vehemence and vigor with which the South African Institute of Race Relations fought against oppression and for a free South Africa. But it is a travesty that now, more than 4 decades after the summit at the Palais des Nations, our people, especially the most vulnerable and poor South Africans, face circumstances tragically reminiscent of those that so appalled the international community 40 years ago. A violent, oppressive, and destructive ideology rules, enriching a minority while the majority of people live in fear, poverty, and destitution. At the beginning of this month, it was made public that the South African government had entered negotiations with the International Monetary Fund regarding a bailout of $4.2 billion. The circumstances that have led to this politically complex decision by the ANC in alliance with the South African Communist Party and COSATU have been in development for years. The Institute of Race Relations monitoring throughout those years the gradual worsening and weakening of debt, fiscal, and economic circumstances. During this time of wasted opportunities, the Institute maintained its role of now almost a century, that of being a leading voice of warning to successive governments to change course by pursuing alternative pro-freedom, pro-growth policies and proposing such to government and policymakers in all spheres and circles of influence. While cognizant of the importance of national sovereignty, the Institute of Race Relations has in the past recognized the merit in the South African government approaching the International Monetary Fund for support, and such offering opportunities for structural change and reforms much needed to reverse the decline and malaise that have come to characterize the South African social economy. With the global impact of COVID-19 and the accompanying governmental decisions to deal with this pandemic, the economic and fiscal situations in South Africa have become unquestionably dire. From this, the decision of the ANC and its allies to approach the IMF. However, it must be appreciated that the COVID-19 crisis was essentially a crisis on top of several other crises, the combination of which has pushed South Africa near the brink. The COVID-19 pandemic did not cause the structural weaknesses in the South African economy, nor inhibit fundamentally, in a foundational manner, the government's ability to improve the lives of South Africans. The crisis merely exposed already existing weaknesses. As the IRR has been a warning voice to successive governments for well over a decade, it has been and continues to be the policy failures of government that has seen unemployment rise, productivity and economic growth stagnate and decline, investment and capital fleeing our country, social unrest and civil dissatisfaction climb. It is regrettable that the governing ANC implemented policies that saw it deviate significantly from the policy course it had pursued to marked success in the first decade of its governance. Through pragmatic and restrained fiscal policy and liberalized economic policy, the governments of Presidents Mandela and Mbeki achieved laudable progress that resulted in the improving of the material circumstances of millions of South Africans, especially Black South Africans, bearing the brunt of the unjust and cruel legacy of apartheid. Important progress was made in righting the fiscal ship of South Africa, illustrated by the achievement of budget surpluses in 2007 and 2008. In 2008, South Africa's debt to GDP ratio stood at 26.6%, bearing testament to the prudence of government spending in the preceding decade. Simultaneous to this improving fiscal health situation, economic growth managed to fall in step with the world average for the first time in decades, achieving GDP growth rates above 5% for the years 2004 to 2007. While the government at the time faced accusations of so-called jobless growth, the data exposes this as an untrue and politically opportunistic accusation. Unemployment fell by almost 10% in those years, its only sharp and sustained fall since 1994. However, with the change in leadership of the ANC in 2007, combined with the economic crisis of 2008-9, South Africa's outlook changed for the worse. While state capture has received the bulk of the blame for the failures of government over the last decade, the reality is that changes in government policy should bear the blame for these government failures. Fiscal prudence was abandoned in favor of increasing and uncurbed government expenditure, while state intervention in the economy, already becoming initially prevalent during the Mbeki years, was stepped up to a significant degree in mining, agriculture, investment, economic planning, income regulation, and property rights. The country over the next decade would start reaping the whirlwind. Going into this current crisis with Treasury estimates of economic contraction in excess of 16% and IRR estimates of unemployment rising to above 45 or even 50%, it is clear why noted economist Davie Rood called the COVID-19 crisis a crisis on top of other crises. Economist Russell Lamberti has correctly identified the COVID-19 crisis as a trend accelerator. The truth is that the South African raft was sinking before this current storm. Despite the ANC's own successes in government prior to its change of gear in 2007 and its successive failures thereafter, the administration of President Ramaphosa has stubbornly and deliberately refused to alter the policy course that had wrecked the hull of the South African raft. It is with due regard to this that the IRR has made the significant decision to approach the most important and prominent donor nations of the International Monetary Fund. Last week, the Institute's head of policy research, Dr. Anthea Jeffrey, published a paper titled "The 10-Year Lockdown with the Worst Yet to Come." I quote from it now. South Africa's stringent COVID-19 lockdown has largely been lifted with a shift from level 4 to 3 on the 1st of June. Under level 3, most businesses are allowed to operate, albeit subject to strict social distancing and hygiene conditions. However, the country has also been in an unacknowledged policy lockdown for at least 10 years. This especially since Jacob Zuma came to power in 2009 and began implementing radical economic transformation policies aimed at changing the ownership, control, and the very structure of the economy. Mr. Zuma was helped to power by the SACP precisely because, unlike President Mbeki, he had pledged his support for radical economic transformation. In the decades since then, business has been subjected to ever more onerous, costly, and damaging regulation. Coercive labor laws have been made more rigid. Black economic empowerment goalposts have been ratcheted up, with still more damaging effects. Property rights have been steadily eroded to the point where the Constitution is now to be amended to allow expropriation without compensation, nationalization by another name. The rigor of this 10-year policy lockdown remains as yet largely unrecognized. However, by the time the COVID-19 lockdown started in March, the impact of the policy lockdown was clearly visible. Labor law rigidities and the national minimum wage had continued to deter employment and to price unskilled people out of jobs, adding to social instability. Business autonomy and operational efficiency were being steadily whittled away by escalating employment, equity, and BEE rules. Most property owners, both individual and corporate, faced a growing risk of expropriation without compensation. Pressure from prescribed asset requirements for pension funds was increasing. So too were demands for a wealth tax, stricter exchange controls, and a money printing mandate for the South African Reserve Bank. Under the COVID-19 lockdown, business is well aware that it cannot operate at all without the state's consent and full compliance with stipulated health conditions. But under the 10-year policy lockdown, business has also needed the government's forbearance, if not yet its consent, to employ the staff it needs on the competitive terms it thinks appropriate and fair, appoint managers and professionals for their skills and experience rather than their racial identity, procure goods and services on the base of price, quality, and reliability without regard to racial criteria, maintain ownership of land, movable and other assets, retain access to an independent system of private healthcare funded from after-tax income, keep pension and other funds invested in ways likely to generate sound returns, and avoid the hyperinflation and value destruction a major change in monetary policy would usher in. The 10-year policy lockdown had severely hobbled the private sector before the COVID-19 pandemic began. Since then, more than 9 weeks of hard lockdown have crippled the economy and pushed it down onto its knees. GDP, says Business for South Africa, is likely to contract by between 10 and 17% this year. The budget deficit could rise to 10% of GDP, while public debt as a ratio of GDP is likely to rise to 84% this year. Add in the state's other liabilities, such as guarantees of Eskom debt, and overall public debt looks set to increase to 110% of GDP by the year 2023. Many of the companies barred from normal operation under the lockdown will go bankrupt or simply give up the struggle to survive. Some 4 to 7 million people could lose their jobs, pushing unemployment up from 29% to a staggering 50% or more. The consumer spending that has long contributed to some 60% of GDP will be sharply reduced. Tax revenue this year will be down by a projected 285 billion rand, worsening the 370 billion rand deficit anticipated in February 2020. But public spending on COVID-19 relief for lost income, larger social grants, additional bailouts for distressed SOEs, and increased interest payments will nevertheless have to sharply go up. The economic devastation from COVID-19 will be more severe and prolonged in South Africa than in other countries where lockdowns have also been deployed. This is largely because the 10-year policy lockdown had already brought so many firms and individuals to the brink. The COVID-19 crisis then pushed them over the edge, while the pre-existing damage will also make it harder to climb back. Looking forward, the tripartite alliance has made clear their policy intentions, and it is to this that we want to draw the international community and the International Monetary Fund's attention. The tripartite alliance will seek to bar retrenchments, step up failed and discriminatory race-based policies, forge ahead with legislation that will fatally undermine property and intellectual property rights, speed up the introduction of the National Health Insurance Scheme, the effective nationalization of the healthcare sector, and put great pressure on pension funds to invest in developmental projects managed by state-run development finance institutions. It will demand both a damaging wealth tax and much stricter exchange controls to limit capital flight. It will keep pushing for a major shift in monetary policy to gain access to South African Reserve Bank reserves, reduce interest rates to 0% or less, and start printing money to fund state spending under the rubric of quantitative easing and modern monetary theory. It will use the economic devastation triggered by the lengthy lockdown to push for the rapid adoption of these measures as part of the reconstruction and the radical economic transformation underpinning this process. Given the massive inefficiency and often rampant corruption in the public services and SOEs, the notion that increased state control will speed up economic recovery and ensure its success should be laughed out of court. But the opposite is likely to occur. The voices speaking out in defense of free markets and capitalism, which has in fact helped lift billions out of poverty all around the globe, are likely to be limited. For more media coverage is sure to be given to the ANC and its alliance partners' demands for ever more state ownership and control. Increasingly, this may become the only accepted narrative. The public's often mute acquiescence in the lockdown may also encourage the alliance to believe that expropriation without compensation, the NHI prescribed assets, the unrestricted printing of money and accelerating state ownership and control will be accepted in the same passive way. That all that will be needed to secure the adoption of these highly damaging measures will be to keep depicting them as vital to the reconstruction of the ravaged South African economy. To conclude, the IMF states its mandate as follows. The IMF promotes international monetary cooperation and provides policy advice and capacity development support to help countries build and maintain strong economies. The importance of this mandate to especially the developing nations of the world amidst this crisis cannot be overstated. Much is made of transformation, but the most vital transformation is that of transforming hardship and poverty into inclusive, sustainable, and real economic growth. The IRR has not taken this decision to approach the IMF donor nations to inform them of these realities lightly. But the reality is that creditors or benefactors to the South African government need to know why our country has been brought to its knees once again, and why the people of this country, especially the poorest and most vulnerable, are enduring avoidable hardship. I wish to say to the donor nations of the IMF, as we will do over coming weeks, ne vous trompez pas, lass dich nicht irreführen, do not be misled. The provision of financial support to the South African government that has not denounced and distanced itself from the destructive policies that have wrecked the aspirations of generations of South Africans will be the act of sustaining the hardships South Africans have endured for at least a decade, are now enduring, and are likely to endure. Thank you very much. I will now take a few questions if there are any. Thank you very much. The process going forward will be made clear in successive press statements. The correspondence with the IMF donor nations will be published to ensure that South Africans are included in this vital process of promoting economic accountability in South Africa. Thank you very much.